Can you imagine the happiest day of your life turning into a nightmare in front of the whole town? Maria Fletcher was dressed in white, about to begin her married life, when her husband did the unthinkable. He brutally hit her in the church courtyard before the eyes of God and all their guests. But if you think this is the story of a victim who gives up, you are wrong. No one imagined that blow would unleash a vengeance so cold and calculating that years later it would leave all of California breathless. Get ready, because what you are about to hear, you won't see coming. The midday sun beat down heavily on the cobblestone streets of St. Michael, making the dome of the old parish church shine with an intensity that hurt the eyes. The whole town had gathered in the main square, waiting to see the most beautiful bride of the season step out of her classic car. The bells rang loudly, announcing what everyone believed would be the perfect union between two respected families in the region. However, the hot air brought with it a heavy feeling, as if the atmosphere itself knew that something wasn't right. Maria Fletcher was sitting in the back seat of the car, smoothing the skirt of her imported lace gown, which her mother had chosen so carefully for the 10th time. Her hands trembled slightly over the bouquet of white flowers, and although she tried to smile for her father who was next to her, she felt a knot in her stomach that she couldn't undo. She repeated to herself that it was just normal nerves, the anxiety of everything turning out perfect before the critical eyes of St. Michael's Society. Outside the church, the guests began to grow impatient, fanning themselves with the ceremony programs to combat the suffocating May heat. Murmurs began to grow like a swarm of bees, moving from compliments about the decoration to uncomfortable questions about the groom. Alexander had not arrived at the agreed time, and a groom's delay was something that the town's aunts and grandmothers considered an omen of bad luck. Mrs. Consuelo, Alexander's mother, looked at her gold watch with a mixture of fury and worry, scanning the main street for her son's vehicle. She knew, better than anyone, that Alexander had spent the previous night celebrating his bachelor party too intensely. She prayed silently for her son to appear sober and presentable, begging all the saints not to shame the family name in front of so many important people. Finally, the roaring engine of a black pickup truck broke the general murmur and stopped abruptly in front of the stone steps of the church. Alexander got out of the vehicle, adjusting his jacket with a brusque, misaligned movement that did not go unnoticed by the men present. His eyes were red, hidden behind dark glasses that he didn't take off until he was under the shadow of the portico, and his stride was firm but strangely aggressive. When he passed the first guests, an unmistakable trail floated in the air, a sweet and penetrating aroma of aged tequila mixed with expensive cologne. His best man, a childhood friend who looked just as sleep-deprived, patted him on the back to cheer him up, but Alexander only responded with a dry grunt, did not greet anyone, not even his mother, and walked straight toward the altar as if marching toward a sentence he detested. Maria Fletcher got out of the car as soon as she saw Alexander enter, feeling immense relief that allowed her to breathe normally again. Her father offered her his arm, and together they began the slow ascent up the stairs as the wedding march began to sound on the old organ. People stood up, cell phone cameras rose, and for a moment the bride's beauty made everyone forget the groom's delay. Upon reaching the altar, Alexander did not turn to see her coming. He remained staring intently at the wooden Christ at the back of the church, his jaw tense. When Maria Fletcher's father handed her daughter's hand to him, Alexander took it forcefully, without delicacy, and his fingers felt damp and cold. She looked at him, seeking that complicity they usually had, but he kept his gaze forward, breathing heavily through his mouth. The ceremony proceeded in a kind of tense fog, where the priest's words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. Alexander constantly wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, looking increasingly irritated by the length of the mass. Every time the father spoke about love, patience, and respect, the groom made imperceptible grimaces, as if listening to that advice bothered him. The time for vows arrived, and Maria Fletcher's voice came out clear and sweet, full of genuine hope that moved several ladies in the front rows. When it was Alexander's turn, his words sounded rushed, said quickly, like someone who wants to finish a cumbersome bureaucratic procedure. He didn't look her in the eyes for a single second, while promising to love and respect her every day of his life. The exchange of rings was clumsy. It was difficult for him to slide the band onto her finger, and he forced it with impatience until it went on. Maria Fletcher felt a small pain in her finger, but didn't say anything, maintaining that perfect smile she had rehearsed in front of the mirror. In her mind, she justified everything by thinking that Alexander was stressed by the wedding, by business, or by the unbearable heat of the church. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the kiss Alexander gave her was more of a clash of mouths than a gesture of romantic love. He quickly separated from her and began walking toward the exit without waiting for her, forcing her to trot a little to catch up and take his arm. The guests applauded, throwing rice and white petals, creating a festive shower that contrasted with the newlyweds' unfriendly face. They went out to the portico where the sunlight hit them again, and the official wedding photographer stopped them for the obligatory photo session with the church facade. Alexander audibly snorted, loosening the knot of his tie with desperation, looking around for a waiter to bring him a drink. "That's enough, isn't it?" Alexander said in a thick voice, loud enough for his parents and in-laws who were nearby to hear him. "I'm thirsty, and it's devilishly hot out here. Let's go to the reception hall now." Maria Fletcher's mother fanned herself faster, nervous about her son-in-law's rude tone, but preferred to turn her face away. The photographer, professional but visibly uncomfortable, asked for one last shot. "A hug, please," and a look full of love toward the bride. Alexander put his arm around Maria Fletcher's shoulders, but his weight was dead, more of a burden than a protective hug. She could smell the alcohol emanating from his pores, a stale mixture that churned her stomach for the first time that day. Maria Fletcher, wanting to salvage the moment and have a beautiful memory of her wedding, leaned gently toward her husband's ear. With all the sweetness she was capable of, and trying to calm the beast she felt awakening in him, she whispered an innocent piece of advice. "Darling, smile a little more. The photos will look beautiful if we look happy," she told him in a soft voice. Those simple words acted as a trigger in Alexander's cloudy and aggressive mind at that precise moment. He broke free from the hug with a violent movement, spinning his whole body to face her, with his eyes wide with irrational fury. "You're telling me what to do," he yelled, and his voice bounced off the stone walls of the church, instantly silencing the musicians. The entire square froze, the children's laughter stopped, and the guests who were congratulating each other turned toward the couple. Maria Fletcher took a step back, frightened by the sudden transformation of the man she had just married. "No, Alexander," she only said that. She tried to explain with a trembling voice, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Don't tell me what to do, and don't demand that I smile when I don't want to," roared Alexander, completely out of control, losing any trace of civility. The alcohol in his system and his volatile temper mixed in a perfect storm in front of hundreds of witnesses. No one moved. No one intervened. Everyone was paralyzed by the disbelief of seeing the groom yelling at the bride in the portico. Then, the gesture occurred that would change the lives of everyone in that town forever, the moment that would split history in two. Alexander raised his right hand, open and heavy, and with an impulse charged with contempt, he threw a dry, direct blow. The palm of his hand brutally impacted Maria Fletcher's left cheek. The sound was sharp, like the crack of a whip, and echoed with a macabre resonance in the absolute silence of the square. The force of the impact was such that the delicate wedding veil came loose from her hairstyle and fell slowly to the dirty ground. Maria Fletcher lost her balance, her heels gave way, and she fell to her knees on the hard stones, bringing her hands to her face. The world seemed to stop in that second. The birds stopped singing, and the wind stopped blowing. The red mark of Alexander's fingers instantly began to appear on the bride's pale skin, visible to everyone. She didn't scream. She simply stayed there on her knees looking at the ground, unable to process that the love of her life had hit her minutes after swearing eternal love to her. Alexander stood over her, breathing raggedly, his chest heaving up and down, showing not an ounce of immediate repentance. He looked around, defiant, as if waiting for someone to dare to question his authority over his new wife. Horror settled in the eyes of those present, a mixture of fear and second-hand shame that chilled the blood. It was in that instant of sepulchral silence that Maria Fletcher's first choked sob was heard, a broken sound that broke the soul. And as she cried on the ground, with her white dress getting stained with dust, everyone knew that the party had ended before it began. The fairy tale had become a public nightmare, and Maria Fletcher's hell was just opening its doors. The heartbreaking scream of Maria Fletcher's mother broke the collective trance, acting as a signal for hell to break loose in the church portico. Older ladies brought their hands to their mouths to stifle their own screams, while pulling small children to hide their faces in their skirts to prevent them from seeing more violence. The guests, who seconds before were celebrating, backed away in a wave of panic, tripping over each other in their eagerness to get away from the groom, who seemed to emanate a dark and dangerous energy. No one could believe that the wedding of the year had turned into a police scene in a matter of seconds. Alexander did not move to help his wife, nor did he look down to see the damage he had caused to her face, which was already beginning to swell visibly. Instead, he began to walk in small circles, like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair, with an excessive frustration that scared everyone. "That's what you get for trying to control me," he shouted in a hoarse voice, pointing an accusing finger at the woman lying on the ground. For him, in his logic twisted by alcohol, she was to blame for having provoked him with that harmless whisper. The bride's father, a respected and peaceful countryman, emerged from his initial stupor with his face distorted by fury and his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He tried to lunge at Alexander to defend his daughter's honor, but two of his own brothers held him by the arms, fearing that a fistfight would worsen the tragedy. "Let me go! I'm going to kill that bastard!" the man roared, with the veins in his neck bulging, while his son-in-law looked at him with a cynical and challenging smile. Mrs. Consuelo, Alexander's mother, was pale as a sheet, trembling from head to toe as she looked alternately at her son and the crowd that judged them with their eyes. She tried to approach him to calm him down, whispering his name in supplication, but Alexander shook off her touch as if it burned his skin and looked at her with contempt. "Don't touch me either, Mom. All women are equally manipulative," he spat, leaving his mother speechless and heartbroken. Maria Fletcher, still on the ground, felt a deafening buzz in her ears that drowned out the screams and the chaos surrounding her in that bitter moment. She brought her hand to her mouth and felt a metallic hot taste, realizing that the blow had injured the inside of her lip against her teeth. She couldn't lift her head. Shame weighed more than the physical pain. She felt the eyes of the whole town fixed on her back like burning needles. The bridesmaids, dressed in pastel tones, finally reacted and ran toward her, forming a human barrier to protect her from the sight of the curious and the aggressor. They knelt in the dust, regardless of their expensive dresses, hugging their friend, who was trembling like a leaf in the middle of a storm. "It's over, baby. It's over. Don't look at him. they whispered in her ear, although they knew that this white lie could not erase the reality of what had just happened. Father Thomas, an old man who had baptized most of those present, walked down the altar steps in a hurry, his cassock moving with the wind. His face reflected a righteous indignation. Never in his 40 years of priesthood had he witnessed such a profanation at the doors of God's house. He planted himself firmly in front of Alexander, raising an authoritative hand to demand that he stop and show some respect. "Son, fear God! What the hell are you doing?" the priest exclaimed in a powerful voice, trying to use his moral authority to stop the young man's madness. Alexander stopped short and looked at him up and down with a total lack of reverence, letting out a mocking laugh that chilled the most devout parishioners. Respect for the church, for elders, and for decency seemed to have evaporated from his body, along with sobriety. "Don't get involved, Father. This is a matter between my wife and me," Alexander replied, invading the priest's personal space in a threatening and rude manner. "She wanted to humiliate me by telling me how to behave, and I am no one's puppet. Did you hear me well?" He continued yelling, spitting saliva as he spoke. The crowd held its breath, fearing that the groom would be capable of assaulting the church representative as well. Father Thomas did not back down, keeping his gaze fixed on the young man's glassy eyes, trying to find some trace of the child he had known years ago. But before he could say another word, Alexander lost the little patience he had left and pushed the priest hard on the chest. The old man stumbled backward, losing his balance, and had to be supported by two altar boys so as not to fall rolling down the stone stairs. A collective scream of horror rose from the square. Pushing a priest was a limit that no one in that traditional town imagined anyone would ever cross. That gesture finished breaking any bond of empathy anyone might have felt for the groom. Now he was a pariah in the eyes of all. Alexander was left alone in the middle of the portico, surrounded by an empty circle, while everyone looked at him as if he were the devil himself. Taking advantage of the distraction of the push to the priest, Maria Fletcher's older brother and two cousins carried the bride, lifting her up, almost dragging her. Her legs were weak, and the white dress was stained with gray dirt on the knees and hem, a sad image of defeat. "Let's go inside, Maria. You don't have to listen to this animal," her brother told her in a voice broken by contained rage. They carried her back inside the church, seeking refuge in the cool dimness of the temple, away from the cruel sunlight and the sight of the public. They closed the heavy carved wooden doors with a muffled slam, leaving out Alexander's screams and the murmur of the people. Inside, the silence was sepulchral, only broken by the bride's uncontrollable sobs that echoed against the high stone vault. Outside, Alexander reacted to seeing his victim being taken away and ran toward the closed doors, banging the wood with his clenched fists. "Open the door, Maria. Don't hide. We're not done talking yet," he shouted, completely oblivious to the grotesque spectacle he was putting on. His own friends, ashamed, looked at each other, not knowing whether to intervene or let him sink into his misery alone. Modern technology, cruel and fast, came into action. Dozens of cell phones rose among the crowd like silent digital witnesses. From different angles, guests and curious passers-by in the square recorded every insult, every knock on the door, and every gesture of madness from the groom. No one physically intervened, but everyone documented the social downfall of one of the richest families in the region. The videos began circulating in the town's instant messaging groups before Alexander stopped banging on the church door. "Look what happened at the Lopez wedding," said the messages, accompanied by high-definition clips of the exact moment of the slap. The news flew faster than the wind, jumping from phone to phone, crossing the municipality's borders in a matter of minutes. Mrs. Consuelo, seeing that her son was being filmed, and that their reputation was crumbling live, desperately tried to cover the cameras with her hands. "Stop recording! Respect the family's privacy!" she screamed. But it was useless to try to stop the digital tide that was coming toward them. The scandal was no longer a town rumor. It was becoming a viral news story that no one could erase from the internet. Alexander, noticing the cell phones pointing at him, far from hiding, seemed to become more emboldened, as if he were acting for an invisible and morbid audience. He turned toward one of the cameras and shouted, "Record everything you want, so you learn to respect a real man." His words were recorded for posterity, socially condemning him with irrefutable evidence of his violent character. Inside the church, Maria Fletcher was sitting on a wooden bench, trembling, while her mother cleaned her face with a damp cloth. Her left cheek was red and hot to the touch, and her eye was beginning to close slightly from the inflammation of the brutal blow. "Why, Mom? Why did he do this to me?" she asked through tears, unable to understand how the happiest day had turned into a tragedy. Maria's father, pacing back and forth in the central aisle, spoke on the phone with the local police, demanding that they come and remove the aggressor from the property. "I don't care who his father is. I want you to take him away right now, or I'll take care of him myself," he said in a fearful voice. The bride's family closed ranks, swearing to protect her, although they knew that the emotional damage would be much more difficult to cure than the blow. Outside, the square began to empty of decent guests who, horrified, preferred to go home rather than continue witnessing the embarrassment. The caterers from the reception hall, who expected to receive 300 people, began calling to cancel the banquet and the music. The gourmet food, the expensive floral arrangements, and the 5-layer cake would remain untouched, silent witnesses to a celebration that never happened. The main video, titled "Groom Slaps Newlywed Wife in Front of Church," began to gain thousands of views on social media in less than an hour. Comments from strangers began to pile up, full of hatred toward Alexander and pity toward the poor girl in the video. The public trial had begun, and the verdict was unanimous. Alexander was the most hated villain of the moment across the entire state. Finally, upon hearing the police sirens approaching, Alexander's friends managed to convince him that he had to leave before he was arrested right there. Reluctantly, and still shouting curses into the air, he got into the black pickup truck he had arrived in, screeching tires as he drove off. He left behind a cloud of smoke and a heavy silence, loaded with tension and unanswered questions about the future. Maria Fletcher stayed inside the church until nightfall, unable to face the outside world and the looks of compassion she knew awaited her. She took off her wedding ring, which she had only worn for less than an hour, and left it on the dark wooden bench, shining solitarily. That small gold circle now represented a chain from which she had been freed in the most painful way possible. The news spread like wildfire throughout the entire state, jumping from cell phone screens to the headlines of primetime television news. The wedding jerk, or the slapped bride, were the phrases that headed the reports, accompanied by the blurry but undeniable image of the exact moment of the aggression. St. Michael, a quiet town known for its colonial architecture and patron saint festivals, became overnight the epicenter of a national debate about violence. Foreign journalists arrived with their vans and microphones, camping outside the church and the homes of both families, hungry for an exclusive. Alexander, the protagonist of this shameful drama, had vanished as if the earth had completely swallowed him up as soon as he left the square. No one knew where he was. His truck was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, near the federal highway, with the keys in and the door open. His family immediately closed ranks, lowering the blinds of their mansion and disconnecting the landlines to avoid the constant harassment of the press and the curious. Rumors circulated in the market that they had sent him abroad or to a distant ranch in the north to hide him until the waters calmed down. Maria Fletcher, for her part, could not stand another second in her parents' house, where she felt the walls suffocating her with memories and looks of pity. Every time the doorbell rang, her heart raced, thinking it was him, coming back to finish what he had started, or to ask for forgiveness that she didn't want to hear. She needed to escape, not from the town, but from the compassionate gaze of the people who had seen her grow up and who now saw her as a broken victim. She packed a small suitcase with old clothes and asked her father to take her far away, very far from the noise and the shame. The chosen destination was the old house of her maternal grandmother, Mrs. Soledad, located high up in the Sierra Nevada, where the internet signal was almost non-existent. The journey was long and silent. Her father drove with white knuckles on the steering wheel, holding back the urge to cry or scream out of the impotence of not having protected his little girl. Upon arrival, the cold mountain air and the smell of burning wood greeted her like an old, familiar hug that promised her a temporary refuge. Her grandmother was waiting for her at the wooden gate, wrapped in a gray shawl, with the firm gaze of someone who has seen many storms and knows that they all pass. Mrs. Soledad did not ask stupid questions or offer empty consolations when she saw her granddaughter get out with a marked face and a broken spirit. She simply opened her arms and let Maria Fletcher collapse onto her chest, crying everything she hadn't been able to cry in front of the cameras. She took her to the back room, the same one Maria used when she was little during summer vacations, where the bed had hand-knitted spreads and smelled of dried lavender. There, between those 4 thick adobe walls, the true ordeal of isolation began. The absolute silence after the noise of the scandal. The first days were a gray haze, where time seemed to have stopped completely, without hours or routines, only darkness and pain. Maria Fletcher refused to get out of bed, spending hours looking at the wooden beams of the ceiling, reliving the scene in her head again and again. She wondered what she had done wrong, if her tone of voice had been incorrect, if she should have kept silent, falling into the mental trap of guilt. Alexander's voice yelling at her resonated in her ears, louder than the wind blowing outside, tormenting her even in her dreams. Her cell phone, which had been her connection to the world, lay turned off at the bottom of a dresser drawer, like a dangerous artifact she didn't want to touch. She knew that if she turned it on, she would find thousands of messages, some of support, others of mockery and videos that would repeat her humiliation eternally. She preferred ignorance, the informational void of the Sierra, where the only news was brought by the milkman or the neighbors who went up to buy cheese. She disconnected from her own life, becoming a ghost who wandered the corridors of the house in a nightgown. The mark on her cheek began to change color, going from intense red to a purple tone, and then to a greenish yellow that gave her a sickly appearance. She avoided mirrors at all costs, covering the one in her room with a sheet, because she couldn't bear to see the reflection of the beaten woman looking back at her. She felt that this mark was not only on her skin, but had tattooed her identity, that she was now the beaten one, and would cease to be Maria Fletcher forever. She felt dirty, stained by public violence, as if she had lost a dignity she would never recover. On the living room coffee table, the bridal bouquet she had been carrying when she arrived lay forgotten, an arrangement of white roses and orchids that had cost a fortune. As the days passed, the flowers began to wither. The white petals turned brown and crunchy, falling one by one onto the embroidered tablecloth. Maria Fletcher sat on the armchair watching them for hours, seeing in that dying bouquet the perfect metaphor for her marriage and her self-esteem. No one dared to throw the flowers in the trash. They remained there like a funerary monument to broken illusions. Mrs. Soledad would enter the room with plates of chicken broth and cups of hot atole, a traditional warm beverage, forcing her granddaughter to eat at least a few spoonfuls so she wouldn't get sick. The body heals quickly, my child. What takes time is the soul. But that too has a cure if one wants it, she would say in her scratchy but loving voice. The old woman didn't pressure her to talk. She simply sat next to her knitting, offering her silent company as an anchor in the middle of the emotional tide. She knew that words were unnecessary when the pain was so great that it occupied all the space in the house. Down below, in the town, life continued at its usual pace. But the topic of conversation on every corner continued to be the failed wedding and the groom's whereabouts. Society was divided. While the majority supported Maria, there were also the misogynistic and cruel voices that whispered that she must have done something to provoke him. That social hypocrisy reached the ears of Maria's father, who had to restrain himself several times from fighting with old friends in the bar. Shame spread like an oil slick, affecting everyone with the surname of both families. Alexander's mother tried to call the grandmother's house a couple of times, seeking, she claimed, to mediate the situation and see how her daughter-in-law was. Mrs. Soledad, with the firmness of an oak, answered the landline and forbade her from calling again, telling her that her son had no forgiveness from God or men. "Don't dare bother her, ma'am. Deal with the shame of the son you raised and leave us alone," she sentenced before hanging up forcefully. It was the first time anyone had put the wealthy matriarch in her place, defending Maria like a lioness. Nights in the Sierra were long and cold, filled with the sounds of nocturnal animals and the creaking of old wood that frightened Maria Fletcher in her vulnerable state. She would wake up startled, covered in cold sweat, instinctively reaching to protect her face with her hands against an imaginary blow that was no longer there. The trauma had settled into her reflexes, turning her into a fearful creature who feared her own shadow and loud noises. She would cry in silence so as not to wake her grandmother, biting the pillow to stifle sobs of absolute desperation. 2 weeks passed, and the bouquet of flowers on the table was already a dry, sad skeleton. But Maria Fletcher still didn't have the strength to throw it away or go out into the garden. She felt like a prisoner in her own body, trapped in a cycle of depression that took away her desire to bathe or brush her hair. Her hair, once shiny and well-kept, was dull and tangled, an external reflection of the chaos that reigned inside her shattered self. She looked at her hands and didn't recognize the fingers that had worn the ring. She felt they belonged to someone else, to a woman who no longer existed. One day, her grandmother entered the room and abruptly opened the curtains, letting the raw morning light flood the room and bother Maria's eyes. "Enough with the mourning, my child. Crying for a living man who is worth nothing is wasting tears," she said with authority, pulling clean clothes from the closet. "Today, you are going to get up. You are going to take a bath, and you are going to help me shell the corn, because work cures pain better than bed." Maria tried to protest, but her grandmother's gaze did not tolerate replies, so she got up, dragging her feet. Going out to the patio was a shock of reality. The sun, the wind, and the singing of the birds violently contrasted with the darkness in which she had lived locked up. She sat on a wooden bench under the large walnut tree and began to work with the corn cobs, feeling the rough texture in her delicate hands. The repetitive and mechanical movement of her fingers gave her mind a small break, a pause in the whirlwind of painful thoughts. For the first time in days, she didn't think about Alexander for 5 minutes straight, and that was a small, invisible victory. However, The peace was fragile. That same afternoon, a lawyer arrived from the city in a luxurious car that stood out on the dirt and stone road. He came representing Alexander, bringing documents and a financial offer to repair the damages and avoid a major criminal lawsuit. Maria's father, who had come up to see her, chased the man off the property screaming, threatening to unleash the dogs if he didn't leave immediately. Maria heard everything from the window, trembling with rage at the thought that he believed her dignity had a price in dollars. That incident ignited a different spark inside her. It was no longer just sadness or fear. Now she began to feel a different heat in her chest, indignation. How dare he try to buy her silence after having humiliated her in front of everyone and ruined her life? She looked at the dry bouquet on the living room table with different eyes, no longer with pity, but with disgust for what it represented. Those dead flowers were the symbol of her submission, of her passive waiting, and suddenly they seemed offensive to her. She walked toward the table with a determined step, took the dry floral arrangement with both hands, and felt how the brittle leaves crumbled to the touch, falling to the floor. She walked to the fireplace where some oak logs were burning, and, without thinking twice, threw the entire bouquet into the fire. The flames licked the dry flowers, consuming them in seconds with a quick crackle, turning the memory of the wedding into gray ash and smoke. She stood watching the fire, feeling that something inside her had also burned, giving way to something new. Mrs. Soledad watched her from the doorframe, nodding slightly, knowing that this was the first real step toward her granddaughter's recovery. "Fire purifies, Maria. Let the bad burn, so the good can be born," the old woman murmured, returning to her chores in the kitchen. Maria Fletcher did not respond. She remained hypnotized by the flames, feeling the heat dry the tears that still ran down her cheeks. But recovery would not be a straight line. That night she dreamed of the blow again and woke up screaming, reminding her that the road would be long and tortuous. The difference was that, upon waking, instead of curling up in a fetal position, she sat on the bed and turned on the bedside lamp. She took out an old notebook and a pencil and began to write everything she felt, emptying the venom from her mind onto the paper. She wrote furiously, tearing the sheet several times with the tip of the pencil, letting out the hatred she had been repressing. Days turned into weeks, and the isolation in the Sierra ceased to be a flight to become a necessary retreat to rebuild herself piece by piece. Maria began to eat better, regained color in her cheeks, and helped her grandmother with the animals and the garden. However, her gaze had changed. It no longer had the innocent sparkle of the hopeful bride. Now her eyes were dark, deep pools, full of distrust. The sweet girl from St. Michael had died in that portico, and the woman who inhabited her body was now a stranger to herself. The townspeople stopped seeing her, and with her absence the gossip began to diminish, replaced by new news and fresher local scandals. Alexander was still on the run, with an arrest warrant that no one executed, becoming an urban legend of impunity. Maria knew that the world was forgetting her, that they expected her to remain hidden forever, like a marked and defeated woman. But in the silence of the mountains, away from the cameras and the judgments, she was preparing a plan, a new way of life. One afternoon, as she walked along the forest path, she met a group of peasant women carrying firewood on their tired backs. Seeing her, they did not judge her or look at her with morbid curiosity. One of them simply smiled and said, "You're the brave one, aren't you? The one who endured the blow." That phrase stopped her in her tracks. They did not see her as a victim, but as someone who had survived something terrible. That small interaction planted a seed in her mind, an idea that began to germinate strongly. Upon returning home, Maria Fletcher looked at herself in the mirror that she had finally uncovered, observing her already healed face, but with a hardened, serious expression. She was no longer anyone's wife, nor the obedient daughter. She was a survivor who had unfinished business with herself and with justice. She knew she couldn't stay in the Sierra forever, hiding from the monster that had hurt her. She had to go down. She had to face the world again, but not as the girl who ran away crying. The wind blew hard that night, hitting the windows, but Maria was not afraid. She felt strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane before making landfall. She opened the drawer where she had stored her cell phone weeks ago, took it out, and pressed the power button, watching the screen illuminate the dark room. As the device vibrated with thousands of late notifications, she smiled slightly, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. The time for the retreat was over. It was time for the world to hear her own voice. 6 months had passed since that fateful Saturday in St. Michael, and winter had arrived in the region, covering the hills with cold mist. In the state capital, far from the town gossip and the curious glances of the neighbors, a television set was being prepared for a special broadcast. Technicians adjusted the microphones and lights, creating an intimate but professional atmosphere for the most anticipated interview of the year by the local audience. Everyone wanted to see what had become of the bride of the slap, expecting to find a destroyed and weeping victim before the cameras. When Maria Fletcher entered the studio, the silence became so dense that the buzzing of the lights on the high ceiling could be heard. She did not wear mourning clothes or loose clothing to hide herself. She wore an impeccable wine-colored pantsuit, tailored to her figure. Projecting a new confidence, she had cut her hair, getting rid of the long, romantic mane from the wedding, opting for a modern, practical cut that hardened her features. She walked toward the designated chair with a firm stride, greeting the host with a handshake that denoted strength and determination, not fear. The interview began with the routine questions about how she felt and what she had done during all that time of public absence. Maria Fletcher looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall, speaking not to the interviewer, but to the thousands of women watching her from their homes. "I went to the mountains to die a little, so I could be born again," she said in a serious, slow voice that surprised everyone. There were no tears in her eyes, only an impressive clarity that disarmed the sensationalist intention of the program. She talked about the months of depression, the toxic shame that had kept her locked up, and how the support of her grandmother and other women had saved her. She related how she transformed pain into fuel, reading books on law and rights, educating herself to understand that she had not been to blame for Alexander's violence. They teach us to endure, to smile for the photo, not to make the man angry, and that almost cost me my life, she declared firmly. Her words resonated in living rooms across California, making many uncomfortable and empowering many more. But Maria was not there just to tell her personal tragedy or to gain easy sympathy from the television audience. She took advantage of the primetime slot to announce the creation of her foundation, Rebirth, dedicated to providing legal and psychological support to women in situations of rural violence. "I don't want any other bride to think that a blow is a mistake or a sign of strong character," she explained with passion. She showed the organization's legal documents, demonstrating that it was not a whim, but a serious, structured project. The reaction on social media was immediate and overwhelming. The hashtag Believe Maria began to flood Twitter and Facebook, displacing the mocking memes from months ago. Women began to share their own stories of abuse, inspired by the bravery of someone who had been publicly humiliated and had risen up. The video of the slap, which was previously a source of morbid curiosity, was recontextualized as the origin of a legitimate and necessary social movement. Maria Fletcher was changing the narrative from passive victim to resilient leader in real time. At the end of the interview, the Foundation's phone, which had only been connected that day, began ringing non-stop in the small office they had rented. They were women from nearby towns, from forgotten ranches, asking for help, advice, or simply someone to listen to them without judgment. Maria, upon leaving the channel, went directly to the makeshift headquarters, rolling up her sleeves to answer the calls personally alongside 2 volunteer lawyers. That night, she didn't sleep, but not because of nightmares, but because of the adrenaline of knowing she was useful and powerful. In St. Michael, the news of Maria's media comeback fell like a bomb on Alexander's family home. Mrs. Consuelo watched television with her mouth open, unable to believe that this confident and eloquent woman was the same shy daughter-in-law she had scorned. Alexander's friends, who had previously laughed at the situation in the bars, now kept silent, intimidated by the moral force Maria projected. They knew that she was no longer easy prey, but a real threat to the system of impunity that protected them. Maria began traveling to nearby counties, giving talks in schools and community centers, always accompanied by her security team and her father. She did not charge for the conferences. Her payment was seeing how the fear left the women's eyes as they listened to her talk about freedom. She became an uncomfortable figure for local authorities, from whom she demanded results in stalled domestic violence investigation files. "If you don't do your job, we will make it public," she warned them in meetings, without lowering her gaze before the police commanders. One case in particular marked her consolidation as a leader, an 18-year-old girl named Lupita, who had been beaten by her boyfriend at a local fair. The police refused to take the report, arguing that they were lovers' quarrels, and there was no need to exaggerate. Maria Fletcher arrived at the police station with her legal team and a live transmission from her cell phone, demanding justice for Lupita. The pressure was such that the aggressor was detained in less than 2 hours, and the entire town saw the power of the organization. Her image began to appear on urban murals, painted as a modern saint with a megaphone instead of a rosary, surrounded by violet flowers. The misogynistic men of the town called her the troublemaker or the embittered one, but they didn't dare say it to her face for fear of being exposed. She ignored the insults, focused on her mission, feeling that every woman she helped healed a little more of her own internal wound. The invisible scar on her soul was closing, not with forgetfulness, but with action and justice. Maria's physical transformation was also evident. She had gained weight and muscle. She looked healthy and full of a vibrant energy that attracted people. She no longer walked hunched over, but with her back straight and her head held high, occupying the space that belonged to her in the world. Her laughter, which had disappeared for months, was heard again in work meetings, a loud, genuine laugh. She had discovered that happiness did not depend on a husband or a perfect wedding, but on being the owner of her own destiny. However, not everything was success and applause. Anonymous threats began arriving at the Foundation's office in envelopes without a return address, notes cut from newspapers with messages like, "Shut up," or "We will shut you up," and photos of her, with her eyes crossed out with red marker, appeared under the door. Her father begged her to be careful, not to provoke the powerful people who protected the aggressors in the region too much. But Maria kept the threats in a special folder, using them as evidence that she was touching the right nerves of the rotten system. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing files, she received a visit from an older woman, humbly dressed, who turned out to be Alexander's former housekeeper. The nervous woman, looking around, confessed that Alexander had always been violent, even with his own mother. and with animals. She told her horror stories that happened behind the walls of the mansion, confirming that Maria had saved herself from a much worse fate. That information gave Maria a new perspective. Alexander was not momentarily sick. He was a systematic predator. With this new information, Maria decided to broaden her fight, not only supporting victims, but pressuring the prosecutor's office to actively search for Alexander. She launched a social media campaign titled "Where is the Aggressor?" with a photo of her ex-husband and anonymous reporting numbers. Alexander's face was back on all Facebook walls, but now not as a meme, but as a fugitive sought by society. The pressure on his family became unbearable. Their businesses began to suffer boycotts from the community. Maria's personal life also began to bloom timidly. She met a human rights lawyer named Carlos, a calm and respectful man who admired her fight. Although she was not ready for a romantic relationship, she found in him a solid friendship and intellectual support that she had never had with Alexander. Carlos helped her draft the complaints and accompanied her to the hearings, becoming her right-hand man and confidant. For the first time, Maria experienced what it was like to have a man by her side who did not seek to control her, but to empower her. The success of the Rebirth Foundation attracted the attention of opportunistic politicians who wanted to take photos with her to win votes in the upcoming elections. Maria received them coldly, accepting resources if they were for the victims, but refusing to endorse any corrupt candidate. "My party is women, not your colors," she told them, leaving them disconcerted by her unyielding integrity. She quickly learned to navigate the murky waters of politics without getting stained, maintaining her autonomy at all costs. On the first anniversary of the failed wedding, Maria organized a silent march from the St. Michael Church to the main square. Hundreds of women dressed in white, with lit candles, walked with her in a solemn procession that illuminated the town's night. There were no shouts or vandalism, only a compact mass of feminine dignity that demanded security and respect in the streets. Upon arriving at the portico where she was hit, Maria placed a white flower on the ground, symbolically closing a cycle of pain. From the balcony of the municipal presidency, the mayor watched the demonstration with concern, realizing that Maria had more power to convene than he did. The town had changed. Women no longer bowed their heads when their husbands raised their voices at the market. A new awareness was floating in the air, a static electricity that foreshadowed deep changes in the region's social structure. And it all began with a slap that tried to humiliate one woman and ended up waking up all of them. But peace is a fragile state when there are scores to settle, and the past has a bad habit of returning when one least expects it. As Maria gave the closing speech of the march, she felt a chill run down her spine, that instinctive feeling of being watched with hatred. She searched among the crowd, in the shadows of the trees in the square, but only saw friendly faces and flickering candles. She told herself it was paranoia, that she was safe surrounded by her people and her new strength. What Maria didn't know was that kilometers away, in a cheap roadside motel near the border, a man was watching the march's live broadcast on a cell phone with a cracked screen. Alexander, with a grown beard, much thinner and looking haggard from months of fleeing and vices, watched the image of his triumphant ex-wife with obsession. Rage gnawed at his insides, seeing her so strong, so much her own person, while he lived like a hidden rat. He crushed an empty beer can with his hand, feeling the metal give way under his frustration, and muttered curses at the bright screen. He couldn't stand that she had turned his mistake into a ladder to success, while he had lost everything: money, family, and reputation. In his distorted mind, she had stolen his life, and he was determined to get it back or destroy her in the attempt. The public humiliation he now felt was a motor as powerful as hers, but fueled by the darkest resentment. Alexander got out of the dirty bed, took a worn backpack, and looked at his reflection in the bathroom's stained mirror, barely recognizing the man he was. "Enjoy your moment, Maria Fletcher," he whispered to the solitude of the room, with a twisted smile that foreboded nothing good. "Because very soon I'm going back to St. Michael, and this time it won't be to get married." He turned off the cell phone, cutting off the image of the woman who was reborn, and walked out into the dark night, determined to end the party. The villain of the story was tired of hiding, and he was ready to reclaim the starring role he thought he deserved. The calm in St. Michael was about to be broken again, and the real test for the new Maria was just beginning. The economic line bus braked with a sharp screech at the dusty terminal of St. Michael, raising a cloud of dirt that covered the few waiting passengers. From the back door stepped a thin man in worn clothes that were once designer, hiding his identity under a dirty baseball cap and cheap glasses. Alexander stepped onto the ground of his hometown, not as the heir prince who left, but as a ruined stranger who carried all his belongings in a sports backpack. No one recognized him at first. His haughty stride had disappeared, replaced by a hunched, defensive posture, typical of someone who has spent months looking over their shoulder. He walked through the side streets to avoid the center, noting with bitterness how the town had subtly changed during his forced exile in the north. On every corner, he saw purple posters with the logo of the Rebirth Foundation, reminding him that his ex-wife had become the moral owner of the place. As he passed in front of a brick wall, he stopped short when he saw a bright mural painted with Maria Fletcher's face, looking toward the horizon with hope. He felt a pang of corrosive envy in his stomach. She was the hero of the story, and he, the banished villain, who had to hide like a rat. He reached his family's mansion, hoping to find refuge and easy money, but ran into a gate closed with chains and a rusty padlock that evidenced abandonment. He jumped the back fence with difficulty, ripping his pants, and found the garden his mother used to care for converted into a jungle of dry, thorny weeds. The house was empty, the furniture covered with white sheets like ghosts, and the silence in the hallways was a mute accusation of the ruin he had caused. Without money and without allies, Alexander had to find lodging in a run-down boarding house on the outskirts, where the walls were cardboard and the water was cold. Lying on the hard mattress, he plotted his plan with the desperation of a cornered animal who knows he has no other choice but to attack. He knew he couldn't win by force. Maria now had power and people protecting her, so he had to use a different, more subtle and venomous tactic. He decided to play the pity card, betting that the American public, always sentimental, would forgive the prodigal son if he cried enough. The next morning, he used the last coins he had left to make a call from a public phone to a local journalist known for his lack of ethics. "I have the exclusive you've been waiting for," he said in a hoarse voice. "The groom from the wedding wants to tell his truth and publicly apologize." The journalist, smelling money and scandal, immediately agreed to organize an impromptu press conference at the main square's bandstand. Alexander smiled as he hung up. He knew that morbid curiosity was stronger than justice, and that people would want to see the spectacle. He prepared for his performance with the care of a theater actor, shaving his messy beard with a cheap razor, but leaving natural dark circles under his eyes to look distressed. He put on a white shirt, the only clean one he had, but didn't button the collar to project an image of humility and simplicity, far from the arrogance of the wedding. He rehearsed his gestures of repentance in front of the bathroom's broken mirror, practicing how to lower his gaze and how to break his voice at key moments. He felt no real remorse in his heart, only the urgent need to clean up his image so he could return to business and regain his status. The news of his return leaked before the agreed time, and the rumor spread like wildfire through the market, schools, and government offices. "Did you hear? The bastard is back," the neighbors told each other, abandoning their shopping to head to the square with a mixture of indignation and morbid curiosity. The men of the town, many of whom had condemned Alexander publicly, now wanted to see if he had the courage to show his face. The square slowly filled up, creating an electric and tense atmosphere, like the calm before a thunderstorm. In the foundation's office, Maria Fletcher received the news through Carlos, who entered pale with his phone in his hand, fearing her reaction. "He's here, Maria. Alexander is in town and called a press conference in the square in an hour," her friend told her softly. Maria stood still for a second, feeling the floor move under her feet, reliving the visceral fear of that day in the church. But this time, she took a deep breath. She looked at her hands, which no longer trembled, and realized that fear had been replaced by a cold, sharp determination. "We are not going to hide Carlos. If he wants a show, we are going to give him reality," she replied, standing up and smoothing her jacket. Mrs. Soledad, who was present, tried to stop her, arguing that it was dangerous, that the man was unpredictable and violent. "Grandma, I'm no longer the girl who ran to the mountain. If I don't face him today, he will chase me for the rest of my life," Maria sentenced. She instructed her team to accompany her, not as bodyguards, but as witnesses that she was not going to give up an inch of ground. Meanwhile, in the square, Alexander climbed onto the bandstand, surrounded by microphones and cell phone cameras, pointing at him like ready-to-fire weapons. The murmur of the people suddenly ceased when he raised his hands in a sign of peace, showing his empty palms. "People of St. Michael, I know you hate me, and you are right," he began, his voice sounding broken and hurt. "I have lived through hell these months, punished by my own conscience and by the biggest mistake of my life. I haven't come to justify myself," he continued, looking at the cameras with teary eyes. "I have come to say that alcohol and demons got the better of me that day." He spoke of supposed childhood traumas, family depressions, and undiagnosed mental illness, weaving a web of excuses disguised as confessions. Some older ladies, moved by his haggard appearance, began to murmur, "Poor thing," falling into the emotional trap he had set. Alexander, noticing the change in the audience, felt more secure and raised the stakes. "I only ask for a chance to see my wife, my Maria, and apologize to her on my knees as the man who failed but wants to change," he exclaimed dramatically. He knew that by calling her my wife, he was marking territory, reminding everyone that legally, they were still bound by a piece of paper. The crowd was divided. Some booed, yelling, "Cynic," while others asked for silence to hear the rest of the speech. The manipulator was achieving his goal, sowing doubt and dividing public opinion, which was previously unanimous. It was at that moment that the crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a silent aisle through which Maria Fletcher advanced with a firm stride. She carried no weapons or shouts, only her imposing presence and the dignity she had rebuilt, brick by brick, during her absence. She wore white, like on her wedding day, but now it was a modern pantsuit that projected authority, not submission. She climbed the bandstand stairs slowly, never taking her eyes off Alexander, who instinctively took a step back when he saw her. The silence in the square was absolute, so dense that the flapping of pigeons in the nearby trees could be heard. Alexander tried to regain control, extending his arms toward her with a sad, rehearsed smile. "Maria, my love, thank you for coming. Look how I am. "I have paid for my guilt," he said, trying to approach for a hug that would be captured by the cameras. He needed that photo, the image of reconciliation, or at least forgiveness, to clear his name and be accepted again. Maria Fletcher raised a hand, stopping him dead 2 meters away, creating an invisible but insurmountable barrier between the two. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply observed him with clinical coldness, as if she were analyzing an insect under a microscope. "Your guilt?" she asked in a clear, powerful voice, without needing a microphone, projecting her voice for everyone to hear. "You didn't come to apologize, Alexander. You came to ask us to give you back the comfort you lost." "Don't say that, baby. I swear I've changed," he insisted desperately, seeing his script crumbling in the face of reality. He tried to kneel, seeking the dramatic effect he had planned, but the movement looked clumsy and forced before her upright posture. The people began to notice the farce. The difference between Maria's genuine dignity and Alexander's cheap acting was abysmal. "Love doesn't hit, Alexander. Love doesn't humiliate in front of an entire town," Maria replied, and her words fell like heavy stones on the consciences of those present. "And don't call me baby. I am Maria Fletcher, the woman who survived your love." The square erupted in spontaneous applause, cheering the woman who refused to be manipulated again. Alexander's face transformed. The mask of repentance fell for a second, revealing the contained anger he held inside. The corrupt journalist tried to intervene to save the interview, asking, "Ma'am, don't you believe in Christian forgiveness? He is suffering." Maria turned toward the camera, glaring at the reporter. "Forgiveness is personal, but justice is public, and what he did was not a sin, it was a crime," she sentenced. With that phrase, she dismantled the narrative of a couple's problem and relocated it to the criminal territory where it belonged. Alexander, seeing himself cornered and humiliated again, felt the rage rise up his neck, heating his face. "You provoked me, just like that time," he yelled, forgetting his role as the repentant victim, showing his true violent nature before the cameras that continued recording. The public gasped at the transformation. The poor thing had disappeared, and the monster was back. Maria did not retreat a millimeter, waiting for exactly that reaction to expose him. "There he is," Maria said calmly, pointing at him. "That is the real Alexander, the one who blames others for his violence." The municipal police, who had been watching from the edge, began to approach the bandstand, seeing that the situation was becoming aggressive. Alexander looked around, realizing that he had fallen into his own trap, that by seeking attention, he had only managed to confirm his guilt to everyone. Desperate, Alexander looked for an exit, but he was surrounded by the crowd, who now looked at him with open hostility. "This won't end here. You are mine," he threatened, throwing a swipe in the air that reached no one, but sealed his social fate. Maria remained firm, like a statue of justice, while 2 officers climbed onto the bandstand to invite him to step down for his own safety. Alexander's humiliation was complete, but this time it was not because of gossip, but because of his own inability to control his temper. As he was being escorted to a police car to prevent the people from lynching him, Alexander looked at Maria with pure, distilled hatred. She held his gaze until the last second, showing him that he no longer had power over her. However, as the patrol car drove away, Maria felt slightly dizzy and had to lean on the railing of the bandstand. Carlos ran to hold her, worried about her sudden paleness. "Are you okay?" "That was a lot of tension," her friend and lawyer asked, offering her water. Maria nodded, taking a breath, but she knew the dizziness was not just from nerves. She instinctively brought her hand to her lower abdomen, a gesture that went unnoticed by most, but not by the cameras that zoomed in on her face. There was a secret she guarded jealously, something that would change the rules of the game definitively. The people began to disperse, commenting on the bravery of the patroness as they began to respectfully call her. But the drama had not ended. Alexander was detained for disturbing the peace, but he would soon be released. The war had been openly declared, and Maria knew she had to play her last card, one that no one in the town, not even Alexander, saw coming. The sun began to set over St. Michael, painting the sky in orange and violet tones, the colors of Maria's foundation. She descended from the bandstand to applause, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating the times, the risks, and the consequences of the revelation she was about to make. The return of the culprit had failed, but the victim's true revenge was just about to be revealed to the world. Alexander was released from preventive detention just 24 hours after the altercation in the square, walking with the renewed arrogance of someone who knows that money can open any rusty gate. His lawyer, a bald, sweaty man from the state capital, had argued that his client was emotionally provoked and that his detention had been illegal. Stepping onto the street, Alexander adjusted his shirt collar and looked contemptuously at the few remaining onlookers, spitting on the ground as if marking his territory. In his twisted mind, the bandstand incident had not been a defeat, but proof that he could still disturb Maria Fletcher's peace just by showing up. He took refuge in a rented house on the outskirts, away from the judging eyes of the center, turning the place into his war headquarters against his ex-wife. He spent his nights drinking cheap whiskey and reviewing the divorce papers with a sickening obsession, looking for any clause to leave her penniless. "I won't give her a cent, counselor. I want back every last gift I gave her," he shouted at his lawyer. His strategy was clear: suffocate her financially until she had to crawl, begging for clemency just to eat. Maria Fletcher, however, was playing a very different game of chess, one where the pieces were not money, but legacy and honor. From her foundation office, she watched Alexander's legal moves with a calmness that disconcerted her own legal team. Carlos, her friend and lawyer, was worried about her apparent passivity in the face of the annulment demands that arrived by mail. "Maria, we have to respond to the lawsuit. He wants to claim moral damages against you," Carlos insisted, reviewing files nervously. But Maria's mind was focused on a medical appointment that she had kept in absolute secrecy, going to a clinic in the neighboring city to avoid leaks. The doctor, an older, discreet man, had confirmed what her body had been screaming to her for weeks, with morning sickness and sudden dizziness. Seeing the grainy image on the ultrasound monitor, Maria felt neither fear nor sadness, but a surge of primal power. That small being growing in her womb was not a mistake. It was the living proof of her resilience and the key to her final victory. She decided not to send a legal letter or an email to give the news. The scandal had been public, and the response should be too. She called a formal press conference in the main hall of the town's oldest hotel, a neutral and elegant venue. The invitation promised a definitive statement on the future of the Hale family and the Rebirth Foundation. Journalists, hungry for more drama after the confrontation in the square, filled the hall hours before the appointment. Alexander found out about the conference on the radio while shaving, and a sarcastic laugh escaped his throat upon hearing the announcement. "Now what does that crazy woman want? She's probably going to announce she's running for mayor," he thought, completely underestimating his opponent. He decided not to attend, so as not to give her the pleasure of seeing him, but he turned on the old television in the rented house to watch the live broadcast. He poured himself a full glass of liquor, sat on the worn sofa, and waited to see her make a fool of herself, trying to act like a politician. At the agreed time, Maria Fletcher entered the hall, but this time she did not wear stiff suits or dark colors of mourning or fight. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored linen, loose and comfortable, which gave her an almost maternal and serene air that no one had seen in her before. She sat down in front of the table full of microphones, crossed her hands on the wooden surface, and waited for the murmur of flashes and questions to cease. Her gaze swept the room, firm, but without the anger of the previous time. Now, there was an unsettling peace in her eyes. "Thank you all for coming. I know that my private life has unfortunately become a matter of public domain," she began in a soft voice. "For months there has been talk of a marriage that ended before it began, of violence and of sides. Today, I want to put an end to the speculation." She paused dramatically, drinking a sip of water, while in the rented house, Alexander leaned toward the screen, feeling a strange oppression in his chest. "Alexander Hale has tried to sue me, take away my peace, and stain my name, alleging that our bond was broken that afternoon at the church," Maria continued. "But the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are bonds that are not broken with a divorce signature or with a restraining order." The room fell silent. Journalists stopped typing on their laptops, sensing that something big was coming. Maria stood up slowly and, with a deliberate and gentle movement, placed both hands over her abdomen, cradling it protectively. The gesture was unequivocal, universal, and powerful. A murmur of astonishment ran through the hall like an electrical wave. "I am expecting a child," she announced clearly. And the news exploded in the air, instantly changing the narrative of the entire story. "I am 5 months pregnant. This baby was with me in the church portico when I was hit." In the rented house, Alexander's glass fell to the floor, shattering and spilling the amber liquor onto the dirty carpet. He was paralyzed, mouth open, unable to process that he was going to be a father, that his lineage was continuing. A mixture of misogynistic pride and confusion invaded him. He immediately thought, "It's my son. He's a Hale. She can't take him away from me." He already imagined how he would use the child to regain his social position and tie Maria to him forever. But at the conference, Maria was not finished. Her face hardened, and her voice acquired the tone of an unappealable judicial sentence. "I know what you are thinking, and I know what he will be thinking wherever he is hiding," she said, looking at the camera as if seeing Alexander through it. "But I want to make something very clear before the law and society. This child will not carry the surname of an aggressor." The statement caused an immediate uproar. Journalists began shouting questions. "Is that legal? Alexander knows now. You will deny the father." Maria raised her hand, calling for order, without losing her composure. "I have initiated the legal procedures to register my son only with my surnames, and in honor of the woman who saved me, he will carry my maternal grandmother's surname first. The Hale surname in this branch of the family ends here," Maria sentenced, driving the final nail into the coffin of Alexander's pride. "I will not allow my son to carry the inheritance of a man who hits women. My son will be raised with values of respect, far from the toxic shadow of his biological father." It was a radical declaration of independence. She was not only divorcing the man, she was divorcing his lineage. Alexander, watching the broadcast, felt fury burn his veins hotter than the alcohol he had consumed. He shouted insults at the television, kicking the coffee table and overturning it violently. "That brat is mine! You can't steal my last name!" he roared, completely beside himself. The idea that his son would not carry his name was the supreme humiliation for a man raised in the most deeply rooted misogyny of the region. In the hotel hall, Maria continued explaining her decision, citing laws and the rights of children to a life free of violence. "A father is not the one who begets in a drunken night. A father is the one who cares and respects. Alexander lost that right when he raised his hand against the mother of his child, she stated. Her words resonated strongly, generating an instant debate on social media and news reports about paternity and the rights of aggressors. Carlos, sitting next to her, presented the medical and psychological documents that supported the decision to protect the minor from the father's environment. The strategy was impeccable. It was not a whim, but a necessary protection measure against an unstable man. Maria was using the legal system, the same one Alexander wanted to use against her, to build a wall around her future baby. This pregnancy gave me the strength to get out of bed when I wanted to die, Maria confessed, letting down her guard a little and showing her human side. And for that life to come, I will fight until the last consequences. I will not be intimidated, neither with lawsuits nor with threats. She touched her belly again, and that image would become the cover of all the newspapers the next day, the lioness mother defending her cub. The conference ended without Maria accepting questions about the baby's sex or the exact due date, keeping those details private. She left the hall surrounded by her team, walking through the applause of the female reporters, who looked at her with admiration. She had transformed a celebrity scandal into a civil rights milestone, and the town of St. Michael would never again see surnames the same way. As Maria walked out victorious, Alexander destroyed the rented room, breaking lamps and hitting the walls until his knuckles were bruised. He screamed at his lawyer, demanding that he do something, that he stop this madness, that he immediately claim parental rights. I want that child. He's my only chance to clear my name, he vociferated, not understanding that his obsession was not love, but possession. Night fell over the town with renewed tension. Now there was an innocent in the middle of the battlefield. People commented at family dinners about Maria's audacity, some scandalized by the break with tradition, others celebrating her bravery, but all agreed on one thing. Alexander was not going to stand still. His ego had been wounded deeply, and a wounded animal is the most dangerous of all. Maria returned to her grandmother's house, exhausted but happy. Feeling the baby's first kicks as confirmation that she had done the right thing. Mrs. Soledad was waiting for her with a cup of tea and a proud smile, knowing that her surname, that of the strong women of the mountain, would endure. They sat on the porch watching the stars, momentarily oblivious to the storm that was approaching. Because Alexander, in his loneliness and madness, was already plotting his next step, one that did not involve lawyers or judges. If the law didn't give him his son, he would take him his own way. He looked out the window toward the dark silhouette of the Sierra where they lived and swore that that child would carry his last name, even if he had to write it with fire over the ashes of the entire town. The months following the pregnancy announcement passed in a tense wait that kept the entire town of St. Michael on edge, looking sideways at the highway. Maria Fletcher had become an almost sacred figure for the women of the region, who organized spontaneous surveillance shifts around her grandmother's house. They did not allow any strange vehicle to go up the dirt road without being questioned, creating an impenetrable protective circle based on solidarity. The neighbors brought her baskets of fresh fruit, home remedies for swelling, and knitted clothes for the baby, weaving a web of love that shielded the expectant mother. Alexander, for his part, had become a ghost who haunted the run-down bars of neighboring counties, spending what little he had left on vices. His appearance was pitiful. He had lost weight, and his gaze had a manic glint that scared away anyone who tried to approach him. He spent hours drawing absurd plans on paper napkins, tracing routes to get to the Sierra house without being seen by the witches, as he called Maria's protectors. His obsession with the surname and the possession of the child had devoured any remaining trace of rationality, turning him into a ticking time bomb. The local police, pressured by the Rebirth Foundation and the national media attention, maintained a patrol car permanently stationed at the entrance to the rural road. However, Maria knew instinctively that the authorities would not be enough to stop a man who had nothing to lose. She slept with one eye open, stroking her large belly, speaking to her son in a low voice to promise him that no one would ever harm him. The connection with her baby had become her inexhaustible source of energy, transforming fear into a fierce and primal defense instinct. The 8th month of pregnancy arrived, and with it, the most intense rainy season the region had seen in decades, turning the roads into impassable rivers of mud. The sky remained leaden gray during the day and deep black at night, increasing the feeling of isolation in the grandmother's house. Mrs. Soledad, superstitious like any country woman, lit candles to the saints and burned copal, incense, in the corners, saying that the atmosphere felt heavy, loaded with bad intentions. "The devil is loose, my child, and he's looking for a way in," she murmured as she closed the wooden bars on the doors. One Friday night, the storm broke out with biblical fury. Thunder shook the foundations of the house, and the wind howled like a wounded animal among the trees. It was in that chaotic scenario that Maria Fletcher felt the first real contraction, a sharp pain that ran down her lower back and forced her to bend over. It was not a false alarm. The baby had decided to arrive at the most complicated moment possible, defying the elements. Grandmother Soledad, maintaining the calm of someone who has assisted dozens of births, began to heat water and prepare the clean sheets, knowing that they could not go down to the hospital in that weather. Meanwhile, down in the valley, Alexander saw the storm as the perfect opportunity he had been waiting for during weeks of obsessive surveillance. He knew that the police patrol would have taken shelter from the rain and that the noise of the downpour would cover the sound of his engine and his footsteps. He stole an old pickup truck from a nearby ranch and started the ascent up the muddy road, with the wipers struggling uselessly against the torrent of water. He was armed, not with a gun, but with the delirious certainty that tonight he would recover what was his by divine right. Alexander's vehicle skidded in the mud, hitting stones and branches, but he stepped on the accelerator hard, laughing with a mixture of euphoria and desperation. Upon reaching near the property, he abandoned the stuck truck and continued on foot, instantly getting soaked, with the cold water hitting his face. He climbed the back stone wall of the perimeter, cutting his hands on the sharp edges, but feeling no pain due to the adrenaline. He moved like a predator in the dark, guided by the only light on in Maria's room window. Inside the house, Maria's contractions became more frequent and painful, forcing her to walk back and forth across the room, supported by her grandmother. "Breathe, my child, breathe deeply. Your son already wants to meet you," Mrs. Soledad told her, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a cool cloth. Suddenly, the house dogs began barking frantically toward the back of the patio, an attack bark, not a warning. The grandmother stopped short, turned off the light in the room, and looked toward the window with narrowed eyes, knowing that this visitor was not friendly. "It's him, Grandma. I feel it in my chest. It's him," Maria Fletcher whispered, between gasps of pain, squeezing the old woman's arm hard. Mrs. Soledad wasted no time. She went to the closet and took out an old hunting shotgun that had belonged to her husband, unloaded but imposing. "You focus on giving birth. I and the girls will take care of that bastard," the old woman said in a voice of steel. She called the closest neighbors on the radio using the emergency code they had established months ago. Alexander reached this back door and began hitting it with his shoulder, shouting Maria's name in a voice that mingled with the thunder. "Open, Maria! I know you're there! I've come for my son!" he roared, completely out of his mind. The old wood creaked under the impacts, and every blow resonated in Maria's heart like a direct threat to the life that was about to be born. She took refuge in the farthest corner, protecting her belly with pillows, breathing rapidly to control the panic and the pain of childbirth. But Alexander did not count on the invisible security network surrounding that house. Before he could break down the door, flashlight beams appeared through the rain. They were not police. They were the women of the town, the neighbors, the peasant women who had climbed up using shortcuts and trails after hearing the alert. They arrived armed with sticks, farming tools, and stones, surrounding the intruder under the torrential downpour. They were not afraid. They had the accumulated rage of years of seeing men like him hurt their sisters and daughters. "Get out of here, coward!" one of the women shouted, hitting the ground with a shovel to make noise and mark distance. Alexander turned, surprised, seeing himself surrounded by a dozen feminine shadows that looked at him with murderous determination. "Get out of the way, crazy old women! This isn't about you!" he yelled at them, trying to intimidate them by advancing toward them. But none retreated. On the contrary, they closed the circle, cornering him against the house wall in the incessant rain. Mrs. Soledad abruptly opened the back door, pointing the unloaded shotgun directly at his chest, with a gaze that chilled Alexander more than the cold water. "Take one more step, and I swear by the Virgin that you won't leave this mountain alive," the grandmother sentenced, with an authority that admitted no doubt. Alexander stopped, looking at the barrel of the gun, and then at the women surrounding him, realizing that he had lost the advantage. For the first time in his life, the alpha male felt small, overwhelmed by the collective strength of those he considered weak. At that moment of maximum tension, a heartbreaking scream came from inside the house. It was Maria Fletcher, announcing that the final moment had arrived. That scream, full of life and pain, acted as a catalyst for the women outside, who advanced one step closer to Alexander. "You heard her. She's giving birth. You won't stain this moment with your dirty presence," the group leader spat at him. Alexander, defeated and humiliated, understood that if he tried anything, they would lynch him right there without hesitation. With his head bowed and his pride shattered, Alexander slowly retreated toward the darkness of the forest, cursing under his breath, but fleeing like the coward he was. The women did not pursue him. They stayed on guard in the rain, forming a human barrier until they made sure he was gone. Their victory was not violent. It was moral. They had protected the sanctuary of life with their mere presence. Inside, Maria Fletcher pushed with the last strength she had left, supported now not only by her grandmother, but by the energy of all those who were outside. "One more time, my child. One more time. And that's it," Mrs. Soledad encouraged her, and with one last superhuman effort, accompanied by a liberating cry, the baby came into the world. There was no spank. The child let out a loud, clear cry by himself, announcing his triumphant arrival in the middle of the storm. Mrs. Soledad wrapped the newborn in a warm blanket and placed him on Maria Fletcher's chest, who was crying and laughing at the same time. "It's a boy, Maria, strong and healthy," the grandmother told her, wiping the baby's face with infinite tenderness. Maria looked at her son, at those small eyes that sought her, and knew that she had won the war. That child had none of his father's malice. He was pure light, pure future, and he was completely hers. The storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself recognized that the danger had passed and that balance had been restored. The women on guard heard the baby's cry and burst into applause and cheers. Under the light drizzle that remained, they hugged each other, celebrating not only the birth, but the fact of having stopped the monster without shedding a drop of vital fluid. Alexander, wandering lost in the muddy woods, heard the applause in the distance and felt an immense emptiness in his stomach. He slipped on a slope and fell rolling until he lay in a ditch, dirty and alone, defeated by his own obsession. He stayed there until dawn, shivering with cold, while upstairs, in the warm house, a new dynasty was beginning. The police found him the next morning, hypothermic and delirious, and took him into custody. This time without bail, for violation of the restraining order and attempted break-in. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clean over St. Michael, illuminating the puddles left by the night storm. The news of the birth and Alexander's failed attempt spread through the town, but this time there was no malicious gossip, only admiration. People said that the child had been born with a loaf of bread under his arm, a sign of luck, and with the blessing of all the mothers in the town. Maria Fletcher, resting in bed with her son in her arms, received the women who had defended her so they could meet the baby. "This child is also the son of all of you," she told them with gratitude, letting them hold him one by one. They decided to name him Gabriel, like the messenger angel, because he brought the good news that fear had ended forever in that house. Carlos arrived at noon with the civil registry papers ready to be signed, and with even better news. Alexander would be transferred to a high-security state prison. "It's over, Maria. He can't harm you anymore," he assured her, looking at the baby with tenderness. Maria signed the birth certificate with a steady hand, placing the surnames of her maternal lineage, legally erasing any trace of the aggressor in Gabriel's life. That day, the Sierra house was filled with flowers, not funeral wreaths or dry wedding bouquets, but live wildflowers brought by the neighbors. The smell of new life replaced the smell of fear that had permeated the walls for so many months. Maria got up, walked to the window with her son, and looked out at the town below, which shone under the sun. She knew that there was still one final act missing to close the full circle, a public action that would heal not only her wound, but that of the entire community. But for now, in the privacy of her room, she enjoyed the sweetest victory, the peace of holding her free son, knowing that the villain was behind bars, and that she was, finally, the absolute owner of her destiny. Exactly 2 years had passed since that failed wedding that shook the foundations of St. Michael and its surroundings. The morning sun illuminated the pink quarry of the parish church with a clean golden light, very different from the heavy haze of that fateful day. The streets surrounding the historic center were closed to vehicular traffic, but this time it was not for a private rich people's party, but for a celebration of the town. Violet and white banners adorned the lampposts and the balconies of the colonial houses, waving gently in the cool mountain wind. From very early on, people began to congregate in the portico and the gardens, arriving from all the nearby communities with a festive and solemn attitude at the same time. There was no more gossip or judging looks. An air of collective respect and shared pride for what they had achieved together was breathed. The women, many of them dressed in typical embroidered blouses from the region, carried fresh flowers in their hands to place at the foot of the central bandstand. The men, who previously looked suspiciously at Maria's movement, now attended with their families, understanding that respect for women was the basis of a dignified town. Alexander had become a bad memory, a shadow that was slowly fading from the collective memory of local society. It was known that he was serving a long sentence in a high-security state prison, alone and without visitors, paying for his past and present crimes. His family had sold the mansion and left the state forever, unable to bear the weight of the social condemnation that fell on their last name. The Hale name which used to open all doors, was now synonymous with shame and a misogynistic past that no one wanted to repeat. In Grandmother Soledad's house, the atmosphere was one of quiet joy as Maria Fletcher prepared in front of the full-length mirror. She chose to wear white again, an act of symbolic cleansing that sought to purify the meaning of that color in her life. It was not a wedding dress, but an elegant linen suit with wide pants and a silk blouse, projecting an image of power and freedom. She looked into her eyes and no longer saw the frightened girl begging for love, but a complete woman who had rebuilt her soul piece by piece. Little Gabriel, who was already walking with clumsy steps and laughing loudly, played on the rug with a wooden car, oblivious to the historical importance of the day. He wore a miniature Guayabera shirt and muslin pants, looking like the heir prince of a new lineage based on love. Maria picked him up, inhaling the scent of baby and powder, feeling that this child was her greatest victory against the darkness. Today, we are going to change history, my love, so that you grow up in a better world, she whispered in his ear before leaving. The journey to the town was a triumphant procession. People came out of their houses to greet her as the pickup truck passed, throwing rose petals onto the road. Upon arriving at the square, silence became present naturally, a silence full of expectation and admiration toward the figure stepping out of the vehicle. Maria walked toward the center of the square with her head held high, holding her grandmother's hand and carrying her son with the other arm. Carlos, her faithful friend and now partner in the foundation, walked one step behind, smiling with the satisfaction of duty accomplished. The municipal mayor, a young man who had won the elections promising to support the cause of women, was waiting for her at the foot of the central statue. They had decided to remove the bust of an old revolutionary general to place something that better represented the community's new values. A large velvet cloth covered the new monument, guarding the secret that was about to be revealed before everyone's eyes. National television cameras were present, broadcasting the event live, which closed the cycle of violence with a golden flourish. Maria climbed onto the makeshift platform, leaving Gabriel in Mrs. Soledad's care, and took the microphone with a certainty that electrified the audience. 2 years ago, in this same spot, I fell to my knees, hit by the man who swore to love me, she began, pointing to the exact spot in the portico. Her voice did not tremble. It resonated loud and clear in the speakers, bouncing off the church walls that had previously been silent witnesses. That day, I believed my life was over, that shame would kill me, but I was very wrong. The blow that knocked me to the ground did not destroy me. It only woke me up, and with my awakening, all of you woke up, she continued, looking at the women in the audience. We realized that silence is the abuser's best friend, and that our voice is our most powerful weapon. There was spontaneous applause. Some women dried their tears, remembering their own battles, and how Maria's example had helped them move forward. She waited for the noise to cease to continue with the most important part of her speech. Today, this place ceases to be the setting for my humiliation to become the altar of our collective dignity, she proclaimed loudly. We will no longer remember this square for the man who raised his hand, but for the women who raised their faces. She signaled the mayor and 2 women survivors of violence who accompanied her to approach the covered monument. The emotional tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew they were witnessing a historic moment. On the count of 3, they pulled the golden rope and the velvet cloth gently fell to the ground, revealing a bright and beautiful bronze plaque. In large, deep letters, it read, Plaza of the Brave Women, or Valiant Women's Square, and below it an inscription that said, Here no one gives up. Here we all take care of each other. The town erupted in cheers, shouts of joy, and applause that made the ground vibrate, celebrating the new identity of their public space. But the surprise did not end there. Next to the plaque, a modern sculpture had been unveiled that represented one woman helping another up from the ground. It did not have Maria's face. It was a generic face that represented any woman, all American women who fight every day. It was a symbol of eternal sisterhood, sorority, cast in metal, a physical promise that no woman would ever be alone in St. Michael again. Maria touched the sculpture with reverence, feeling the cold of the metal under her warm fingers, sealing the pact with her community. At that precise moment, the church bells began to ring loudly, just as they had on the wedding day. The metallic sound flooded the square, but this time it did not announce a doomed marriage or a false union. The ringing sounded like freedom, like victory, like a celebration of life that continued despite the wounds of the past. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound cleanse the last remnants of pain that might remain in her auditory memory. The parish priest, a new man who had replaced the old one, came out to the portico to bless the square and the sculpture with holy water. "May this place always be a refuge, and never again a court of judgment," the priest said, acknowledging the church's mistakes in the past. It was a moment of spiritual reconciliation for Maria, who had felt that God had abandoned her that day at the altar. Now she understood that her faith had been transformed into action, and that God was in the strength of the women who saved her. Gabriel, scared by the sound of the bells, ran toward his mother's legs, seeking protection and comfort in the midst of the commotion. Maria picked him up again, showing him to the town as the most valuable trophy of her struggle, the future they had managed to protect. People began to chant the child's name, blessing him, recognizing him as one of their own, free from the stain of his biological father. It was the final confirmation that the lineage of violence had been cut at the root to make way for a healthy generation. Carlos approached Maria and handed her a bouquet of white roses, identical to the one she had burned in her grandmother's fireplace, but these were alive and fresh. "For the new bride, the one who married her own freedom," he told her, with a smile full of affection and deep respect. Maria accepted the flowers, smelling their sweet fragrance, and smiled for the first time with complete and unshadowed happiness. She no longer needed to burn them. Now she could enjoy them, because they no longer represented a chain, but a gift from life. The press approached for the official photos, capturing the image that would be the cover of magazines and newspapers the next day across the entire state. Maria Fletcher, dressed in white with her son in her arms and surrounded by women, stood beneath the Plaza of the Brave Women sign. That photo would forever replace the blurry video of the slap in internet search engines. They had rewritten the visual narrative of her life, imposing the image of triumph over the image of victimization. As evening fell, the square turned into a popular festival with mariachi music, typical food, and folk dances that filled the atmosphere with color. Maria danced with her father, who cried with emotion seeing his daughter so strong and so happy after so much suffering. Mrs. Soledad watched everything from a bench, nodding, knowing that her work on this earth was well done. The matriarch had passed the torch of strength to her granddaughter, ensuring the survival of her spirit. A group of small girls approached Maria, looking at her with big, bright eyes, as if they were seeing a superhero in the flesh. "Are you the bride who didn't give up?" one of them asked innocently, using the nickname the press had given her. Maria knelt down to their height, gently stroked her cheek, and answered with the greatest truth. "I am Maria, and you can be a brave woman too when you grow up. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Night arrived, covering the town with a mantle of stars, and the lights of the square shone brighter than ever, reflecting on the bronze plaque. Maria decided to retire early to put Gabriel to bed, walking back to the car with a full heart and a light soul. Looking back one last time, she saw couples walking hand in hand through the square, treating each other with affection and respect. She knew that cultural change would take years to complete, but the seed was planted, and it had deep root. As the car drove away toward the Sierra, Maria thought of Alexander for a brief second, not with hatred, but with absolute indifference. He was the past, a ghost that no longer had the power to frighten her or to define who she was in the present. Her vengeance had not been to destroy him, but to build herself so great and strong that he became insignificant. And she had achieved it amply. Her happiness was the best punishment for someone who wanted to see her miserable. The name of Maria Fletcher became a legend, told in kitchens and schools as a modern fable of resilience. The bride who didn't give up ceased to be a headline to become part of the folklore of contemporary California. And so, in a small town of cobblestone streets and flowered balconies, a woman demonstrated that, sometimes, the end of a fairy tale is not a wedding, but the moment the princess saves herself. St. Michael slept in peace that night, lulled by the Sierra wind, knowing that tomorrow would be another day, a fairer day for all. And in the room of an old house, a woman and her son slept soundly, dreaming of a future that was, finally, completely theirs. The pain was gone, and the only thing left was immense, bright, and sweet freedom. Thank you for joining me until the end of this story. Your time and support mean a lot to this channel. Don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Tell me in the comments what you thought and what other stories you would like to hear. See you in the next video.